Where is everyone based at the moment, location-wise?
Well, let's get to that right now. So let's jump right into it. All right. Good morning, everybody. It is episode 41 in our series. Usually it's Let's Talk Recruiting, but we're announcing something here today. We're going to be doing something a little bit different going forward. All of our panels have kind of been one-off topics where we talk about various things relating to our industry. But as these continue and the conversations get really good and go deep sometimes, D&I or DE&I and B, one of the things probably a topic to decide is a serious topic across the country, and it's worth having more than just one or two conversations. So what we're going to be doing is an ongoing series of content. It's going to be led by Christina Shareef, who's going to be moderating this panel today. So I'm kind of stepping aside from being a moderator, and Christina is going to be taking over here in a second. But we really want to create an opportunity where we can have an ongoing discussion around this topic and I won't steal too much of Christina's thunder, so I'll kind of stop there. But this is something that's sort of going to be a change of something from what we've been doing to kind of go deeper and more consistent and ongoing around ideas and issues in our industry. So with that said, Christina, I'm going to turn it over to you. It's all yours.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Sean. Welcome to our Diversity, Equity, and Belonging Roundtable. As Sean mentioned, our intention is really to come to you the first Wednesday of every month with exciting, informative content around not only how to build your diversity and inclusion program, but really step-by-step delving into some of the deeper topics involving diversity and inclusion. And hopefully you'll walk away from these sessions with some really concrete ideas to be able to implement in your own organizations. If you have any questions or comments along the way, please feel free to leave a message in the chat. I promise we will do our best to get to all of your questions. And please remember that no question is a stupid question. We're all still learning, and we're really all here to mind meld and share ideas. So please feel free to leave your comments and questions in the chat. And that being said, today's session is going to be about the very first steps in starting a diversity program within your organization. We have this morning Daniel, Silke, Simone, and Sean, who will do their own fabulous introductions as they sort of introduce their topics as we sort of go around the room. And we're going to really cover everything today, from the data to, sort of what happens in an ongoing situation. And I thought maybe, Daniel, this morning we could start with you. You wanted to talk about sort of what are the early steps that you've noticed are effective in starting programs?
Awesome. Thank you, Christina. So hi, everyone. I'm Dan. I'm based in New Jersey, typically. I'm in Virginia this week, though, just getting a little break. So that's why I'm at my dad's house, which is much nicer than mine with this nice library. So I've been in TA for about 14 years or so. I spent the first roughly half of my career in large organizations, Fortune 50 companies, organizations that had done a lot of the legwork and had these really robust diversity programs. They had been at it for a long time, and they had really deep pockets to fund these initiatives. And so when I was working there, I was like, great, this is just how things are. When I got into tech about 4 or 5 years ago, I was like, oh, it's not like this everywhere. So I have spent the past 4 years in technology, mid-sized to now probably the smallest organization I've ever worked for. And I've seen, just some of the other challenges where now my eyes have been open to the fact that not every organization really has this down. So I've spent the past 4 years, 5 years almost, in various recruiting capacities, trying to influence and build and start up D&I programs for the couple organizations I've worked with. So that's a little bit of kind of my background and my story and kind of what I'm working on. My current organization is Castle Integration, about 700 employees globally. We provide a lot of outsourced IT solutions, digital transformation, and cybersecurity services, specifically to the hedge fund and alternative and financial services space, not spaces that are really known for being very diverse. So pretty interesting set of challenges here. So to your question, what do you do at the beginning? I mean, it's challenging, and it's challenging for several reasons. I think you want to look at anything you're going to ask for or do you're going to ask for money. You're going to need some understanding and commitment from people in your organization. So I think early on it's important to have that sort of lens and that mindset. Before you start any actual recruiting initiatives, you got to take some time to plan. And I've seen a couple organizations just rush to say, let's just start recruiting more diverse people. I'm like, yeah, that's great, but what are our goals? What are the challenges? What are the problems we're actually trying to solve for? And if we're going to spend a lot of effort recruiting, are we prepared to have a more, let's say, inclusive or less biased selection process? And then what happens if we do actually start to hire a more diverse workforce? Are we ready to actually lead and manage these people and shape the culture and shift the culture of the organization? So these are some discussions that you should be having already. If you're not, I think a great way to start that is to find an executive sponsor, someone in your executive leadership team, ideally C-level, depending on the size of your organization, but find somebody who like gets it, because then you have an ally internally already, and they can help start to drive conversations at the highest level. So then it's not really a surprise when you start doing more kind of publicizing your recruiting initiatives or highlighting some of your kind of key wins with your diversity recruiting program. So I think an executive sponsor is a great kind of first step, and it doesn't have to be a formal thing. They don't need to put it on their business card, but it's just somebody that you have in your organization that can kind of be that champion for you if you should need it. So after that, I think it's important to understand, do you actually have a diversity problem? And if so, what is it? What are the areas that you want to improve on? What are you doing okay anywhere? What are some kind of initial challenges or problems that you think you might be facing? So there's a couple ways to look at this. And I'm going through this right now with my organization, so this is very timely. The first thing we've done is actually looked at our employee data internally. Okay, so up until 2 weeks ago, we had 350 employees. We just doubled in size, so we're going to have to do this again. But we looked at our EEO data, and it was pretty easy to see, okay, great, here's what our organization looks like. Here's sort of our makeup via gender, on race, and be able to just kind of get a picture of our current employee population. And so the data told us a couple of things. One, surprisingly, we're actually, from the purely numerical perspective, we're doing okay. Because then we look at that data, and then you can do a quick check externally with Bureau of Labor Statistics, and they'll tell you, based on the rest of your industry or in your location, here's what the market looks like. So already you have 2 data points. What do we look like? What does the market look like? That's the minimum amount of stuff or information you need, I think, to start creating some meaningful plans or discussions around that. I think from there, it's easy to say and sit down and say, great, well, 40% of our organization is women, so that's great. Well, all right, but then let's look at the levels. So we did that. And the next slice was by organizational layer, where we could say, okay, our line level employee population is great, pretty good, pretty healthy, racial diversity, not so great on gender diversity. I mean, hiring females into IT infrastructure positions is historically very challenging. So we can always do better on that. But then let's look up a level. What about our first and second line managers? What does that makeup look like? Okay, well, we see now where there's a really steep drop off in some of this stuff where it's 95% men at our first or second line level leadership positions. Then what about kind of VP level? Okay, well, of the, let's say 11 VPs we have, 2 are women and 1 is a non-white male. All right, well, that's getting a little stickier. And then you look at our C levels and it's all white men. So, okay, we've now seen that while the numbers might look okay at a glance, when you really start to look at it by level, we can see a few other challenges or areas of opportunity that we can start to address. I've been talking a lot. Any comments or questions so far?
So fantastic information. If you wouldn't mind sharing, just for the folks on the call, you mentioned that you're comparing sort of your internal EEOC data with the market data. Would you mind providing the resources where you were able to pull the market data?
Yeah, I think I started with the Bureau of Labor Statistics. I think it's bls.gov. And from there, I think you can pick your industry and maybe even location, just to get really kind of baseline information. It'll show you across various racial or ethnic groups, what like a overall percentage of the workforce in your field. So I isolated like technology services, and then it would show me like percentage of like white, non-white, Hispanic, African American, whatever, male and female. And that's a really simple snapshot just to start with. Anybody who has like AAPs or OCCP compliance, I mean, you can get, I think, a little bit more granular, or you have to for your AAPs, so you should have that information readily available. But if you don't, I think it's a great place to start.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. And then you also mentioned sort of buy-in from leadership, right? And you need a little bit of money. And the thing is, like, good thing, the executives are usually the folks that have the money, right? So with their budget.
They're supposed to.
How important is it, though, that you have deep pockets to start the diversity program? And from your experience, what are some low-hanging fruit things that can be done, even if maybe you don't have a whole bunch of money to put in the budget towards the diversity initiative?
For sure. That's an awesome question. And I think a lot of other people are going to have much more to add to that one. You don't need a lot of money at all. Low-hanging fruit, at least when I started, low-hanging fruit was looking at our existing vendor relationships and like, where are our jobs? What job boards in general are we on? And can we add something or just kind of shift money from one to another? That'll just get us into maybe a slightly wider population. If you're using anything like Monster, they have a diversity network. ZipRecruiter, I think, touts themselves as kind of being veteran friendly and having a bit of a diversity network. So, look at where you're spending your money already and see if that's getting you kind of where you want to be. Outside of that, there are definitely many local organizations. I know we're going to talk about this later, so maybe we can tie it back in later, but veterans programs, kind of transitioning service members, and then local job banks and job boards are low to no cost, just as a start. I'm sure a few more will come to me a little bit later. But I, like I said, I'm sure other people are going to have a lot more on that one because we're, like I said, just getting started. And the first two things I did was turn on the Monster Diversity Network, turn on ZipRecruiter, and just say, okay, at minimum, if I can just click a button and get my jobs out to more people or a wider network, how can I do that before I start investigating kind of organizations I want to partner with and where I want to invest more time and energy.
Excellent. So for everyone on the call, Monster Diversity Network, Intello, I think I saw it come through the chat as a diversity specific group, ZipRecruiter for veterans. Sean, I see you.
Yeah, kind of a question for everybody. When we talk about executive level sponsor, are we talking the CHRO, or is the goal, should it be to get somebody outside of HR to be the sponsor? Who's like what role is the ideal executive sponsor?
I've seen both. Currently it's my CHRO, but at a previous organization, it was the chief customer officer. So for a couple of reasons, that was the largest employee population in my organization, and that was the only female on our executive leadership team. So it was kind of a no-brainer to be like, look, you have the biggest employee population. I think you can kind of speak with the most credibility, and if we can focus D&I efforts in your organization, it will spill out to other areas. So I think it's organization specific. I've seen it work well both ways.
Do you all feel that HR owns diversity, equity, and belonging, though? Or should it come from other leaders that are tied to the business, right? And then HR is sort of really assisting with developing those programs. What's been your experience and what are your feelings about that?
I would jump in. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I haven't yet introduced myself, but I'm Simone. I'm based out of LA. I actually work with startups in the LA area to help them scale. And I'm currently partnering with a company called WIT Media Group. And they are sort of a portfolio of companies that offer B2B SaaS solutions along with a really cool TV app that you can download called TV Time. But, in terms of just like building, I'm going to talk sort of a little later on in the call about, the importance of sort of structured interviewing as a focal point when it comes to the recruiting end of things. With regard to getting, what Sean had mentioned, I think like it's so important for this to be owned by multiple people sort of within the org. Like I find that there is this culture of, oh, it's HR, you know, and then it's a catch-all, and we don't want that. This is incredibly important for several areas. If you're a sales organization, if you're a product organization, if you're an organization that's focused on marketing, if you don't have diversity in your organization, how can you frankly create a product that's going to be accessible and interesting and inclusive for all, right? Like that's, I think, the biggest thing with tech that I've really lacked understanding around. Like, how can we have such, and I actually linked up in the chat a great TechCrunch article that has a really great snapshot of the diversity that you see in those organizations, like, you know, the big ones like Facebook, Google. I mean, I'm, you know, previously I worked at Amazon. So, you know, I've seen this. This is a big thing. Companies know that it's a big thing, mainly because if you're, again, building products, consumer items, things that consumers, you know, are going to be using, you want to build them for everybody. And the best way to do that effectively is to have everybody part of your employee population. So I would argue it's not owned by HR. I would argue that it's really owned by stakeholders in every part of the organization. I think the idea of sponsorship is great. It's really hard to roll it out though. And it's really hard to influence hiring managers. And that's where I think a lot of people get stuck. Like, you know, you have great candidates. Let's say you have a diverse pipeline. Let's say you have a structured interviewing process. How do you get hiring managers to, you know, ultimately choose to hire people that are different than themselves, which is the biggest conundrum, I think. And I'm going to hit that a little later, but, you know, that's, I think, a big thing to talk about in general.
Absolutely. I'm in agreement with you, and we'll save your little buzz for a little bit later. Daniel hit on a lot of important points around data collection. And Sean, I know this is really your wheelhouse, where you really like to get sort of into the nitty-gritty with data. What are we missing as HR professionals on the data front? What should we be looking for? And or what would you like to underline that Daniel already mentioned?
Yeah, so it does come back to like that starting point, and I'm going to share here in a second this basic reporting or scorecard that I've used at different companies so people know their numbers. I just think at the very, I mean, you should know where you stand all the way throughout, but knowing that at the very beginning, kind of getting your delta to see, are you improving or are you declining, is to really know your numbers. So I'm gonna share my screen and show a card. I call them scorecards that I've used at places.
Awesome. We love to see stuff like this.
So just to confirm, everybody sees my screen. It's an Excel file. It's not fancy or anything like that, but it does the job. Got it? So here's an example of we're at a place, hey, we're defining diversity around gender, and we're defining it around racial diversity. So I kind of chopped it up into two different pieces year over year. So this is, you know, obviously somebody we've been doing for a couple of years, or I've been working with, where kind of to Daniel's point, hey, chop it up by perspectives, right? So here's where we're looking at business units. And these numbers are really just looking at applicant flow. So recruiters can only really control recruiting and take ownership of recruiting. So that's what this scorecard is represented by. When you look at the full picture, you know, ideally I'd be in a room where you'd have a comp person in there to talk about comp numbers. You'd have an HR person to talk about HR numbers. So getting to this point where we talk about diversity of the applicant, right, at the top of the recruiting funnel, whether we're sourcing people ourselves, or they're coming in and on their own. Does the diversity makeup of the top of the funnel kind of reflect the applicant flow? So ideally, if you want to have an absolute 100% equal in a perfect world, no, it doesn't exist, but these numbers should, right, percent diversity, percent diversity, percent diversity at these four buckets of applied, recruiter screened, on-site interview, offers made. Ideally, you want to see those equal, but if you're trying to build diversity, well, then you'd want to see those percentages go up. So depending upon what your immediate goal is, knowing how you're going through that funnel, this is what the numbers tell you. So to look at something like this on a quarterly review tells you, hey, what we're doing effective, and where is it effective? To your point earlier, hey, we got great diversity applicants, but when we get down to offers, there's a change, there's a cause, there's an issue there. And this is just looking at by business unit, but to Dan's point, once you start looking at I call it management level, yeah, there's some serious conversations being had around that, because you start to see, hey, we're good at this level, but we got some work to do over here. So that's really the cause for concern. And when you throw on comp data to existing employees, the conversation gets really serious in that room. So that doing this is, and all this is pulling from your ATS. It doesn't matter what ATS you have. If you can pull a report, all of them can. You can start to compile these numbers. I recommend weekly recruiting when it comes to open recs, but for something like this, the quarterly review, are we moving the dial, really comes into play like this. One other thing around the numbers, right? People are talking about numbers to compare to. Here's one thing that when I look at around like the Census Bureau or the Bureau of Labor and their numbers. Hey, they're great to have, but the questions I get asked are from heads of department. So I was posed a question from a VP of talent a couple months ago. He says, hey, Sean, you're telling me when it comes to our engineers or software engineers, we're at a 20% diversity applicants. Okay, great. Is that good or bad? And I'm like, I don't know. I don't have anything to compare it to. I could tell you if we improved from a year ago or we're getting worse, but I can just tell you what it's at. So at some point, through these panel sessions and whatnot, as we get into reporting and other things on other panels, trying to get a group, hey, can we compare benchmarks? So if you're looking for diversity of software developers in the LA area, what's a good number? Does Snap have like 60% diversity while, Toyota Motors is at 20? Trying to compare like your location, your job role, and your specifics in there is going to be kind of interesting if we can get there to really truly know, hey, are we doing it right, and what's good and what's bad? Where's the bar? That's really what I'm looking for, long conversations, trying to get some bars.
But I think that's great. Like, competing against yourself is good though, right? Measuring your totals, or here's where we are versus a year ago. Like, okay, external data can maybe show us what we should be striving for, but like measure your rates and celebrate that success. If you've already had a year or two or even a couple quarters at this to be able to show just your own success, I think that should be super valuable to executives and to your organization.
I agree with that.
Should be.
No, absolutely. I was having a conversation with someone the other day, and external data could also be good just to measure if the availability of candidates that you're striving to recruit for in the area, right? So that's always important. Okay, Sean, so can you please tell us where we can get a copy of this amazing template that you've presented? Where can folks find something like that, or how can we create one?
So I brought this up in some sessions a while back, and people asked for it. I did put it up on LinkedIn, and I'll find the links and put it in there. I do have like that look and feel as far as how you get that report out of your ATS. You're kind of on your own on that one, but it's not complicated. But yeah, I have the template so you can see the look and feel, tweak it as you like. As we're talking, I'll see if I can find that link and post it in the chat. But I have that one.
I was just going to jump in and say that the other really helpful piece of information, and this again sort of speaks to the topic that I'm going to hit in a bit, but like the notion of conversion rates through the process, right? And this is a tough one because Greenhouse, frankly, has been making it fairly difficult and costly to get this data. So essentially what happens for everyone who uses Greenhouse and other ATS, there's these, questions at the bottom of every application, right? You have to usually enable those questions to make sure that they're ticked. That's a great first step. Make sure that they're, included as part of the application. The next step would be obviously a candidate, has the opportunity and it's completely voluntary to fill out that data. They can say and self-identify, there's a number of different, specific areas that they focus in on the questions. And then the idea is that you pull the data, right? So Greenhouse initially was able to, you can see the number of people against the EO sort of groupings, and then you can see who you've hired, right? So there's like one big list, and then there's a secondary list that shows, and then there's another piece of data that you have to kind of upgrade for. This is pretty costly. I think it's at least 10 grand. So this isn't necessarily what you need, but if you do have an ATS and you have flexibility and you can negotiate, there is that aspect. And the idea is to really understand, okay, so how are we tracking? Where do we see people dropping off through the process? That's a really key indicator too, because this info is great, right? The idea of who's in your organization and then the idea of who's applying, but we really need to understand that middle chunk because that's where we're losing people. How do we create process and how do we create an interviewing cycle that makes sense for everyone and that ultimately does help us include and add to, the diversity statistics that we're looking to go on. So that's another key thing that I wanted to call out.
That's fantastic.
So let me add real quick to Simone's point. Candidate declines, right? So I've been to places where we tracked specific reasons why we were getting dropped out. In this day and age, I gotta believe people are starting to ask, hey, tell me about your D&I program. How are you approaching diversity? If you don't have that answer back and they say, I'm okay, I'm gonna pass. You need to add into whatever ATS the candidate decline and the reason for decline. And that gets tricky if you're doing outbound sourcing, right? Because you're not in the ATS, so where are you tracking that? If you use LinkedIn Recruiter, which we many do for our sourcing, just have something in there, but to be able to pull that reason out and then go back to your company. Hey, here's what I've done before with, back in 2009, we did it for, hey, we blew through all the reload money. We need more budget. So we track every person who says, I'd be interested, but you have to buy me out of my house because I'm underwater. So they track everybody who said no, and they track the companies that they're trying to pull them out from. And to give you the title and company of the people that are saying no and the reasons why I need reload, that's what they took back to finance and they got budget back. So if you're going to track declines because of I don't agree with how you're approaching diversity at your company, make sure you get those titles and companies, because if they're part of your key talent groups, that's when you get people to move and to get budget on it. So titles and companies track those declines.
Yeah. Totally agree.
Really excellent. So just as a couple of takeaways just from the last few minutes for folks on the call, make sure to get your version of the template that Sean presented either on LinkedIn, or he'll put the link in the chat when he can find it.
Real quick, I'm sorry. And I know you're the moderator. I'm not.
No, please.
So I put the link in there. Just so everybody knows, all I do is I pull a raw report, and what you see on that scorecard are just formulas that look into that data. So if you can get the most basic report out of your ATS, and that one that I was showing comes from Workday. So if you can get out of Workday, I think you can get from anything. But just know it may not be as complicated as you think. Just you gotta learn some formulas. That's it. Sorry, Christina, go ahead.
No, that's fantastic. So either get the template or pull your own report. Make sure you track the conversion rates for your candidates as well. Know for sure that there's going to be some data that's not necessarily pure from the voluntary EEOC data, right? And also make sure that you are partnering with HR and your comp folks if you want the numbers to really sort of tell a more complete story as well. Yes. Okay. So we have the data down. We know the very early steps. We now know how to pull the data and where to pull it from. And so now we need a roadmap, right? Silke, can you talk to us a little bit about your experience with building that roadmap?
Yep. Hi, everybody. I want to start by saying it's a pleasure to be here. My name is Silke Olson, and I'm the national recruiting leader for a firm called Moss Adams. We're headquartered in Seattle, and Moss Adams is a top 10 public accounting and consulting firm, primarily located west of the Mississippi. We have about 3,300 professionals and specialize in middle market clients. The type of positions we recruit for, just as a little bit of a backdrop, is we kind of break recruiting into campus and experienced hire recruiting. We hire about just shy of 1,000 people off campus every year, and about 500 what I call experienced recruits. Most of the people we're hiring are folks with accounting, finance, consulting backgrounds into those roles, audit, tax, consulting roles. So I love what Dan and Sean said around just looking at your data, having a starting point, knowing where your holes are. And as was mentioned, in the accounting and finance space, there aren't a tremendous amount of people of color in our industry. And so a lot of it is early identification recruiting, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But if I could leave everybody with just one thing, and that is strike while the iron is hot, and thank goodness There's a lot of conversation and dialogue happening right now around inclusion and diversity and around racism. And we started the conversation with, you know, does HR own this? And I would implore everyone to say that if you can get your CEO behind this, it really is, you know, tone at the top. And our CEO recently stepped onto our inclusion and diversity advisory board because, you know, he determined himself it wasn't something that he could delegate. And so if you know, I would say if you are just now starting, you know, from the ground, now is the time to connect with your C-suite in particular and get their buy-in. And so with that, it's really important that you have a roadmap. And about 10 years ago, maybe more, I've been in recruiting about 15 years. Before that, I was a CPA and practicing auditor. So I didn't come with a tremendous amount of, you know, HR and recruiting background, but we started our roadmap about 10 years ago, and it became a really important strategy document that we shared with, you know, basically our executive committee, our leaders across the firm, our inclusion and diversity board. And we refresh this document every single year and make sure that all eyes are on it and that we have buy-in in terms of what we're trying to accomplish in the recruiting space. And I would say, you know, that's probably the most important thing. After looking at your data, getting that starting off point, it's really coming up with a roadmap, a strategy that you can point to, and a strategy that your recruiters can get behind too, and, you know, pledge to get behind. Our strategic roadmap breaks into 3 different categories, and they're big categories. And you guys, I could spend hours talking about each one, but I'm going to dive into early ID programs in particular, especially if you're in an industry where the talent isn't out there at the experience levels, and you really need to be thinking about going into underrepresented schools. And for example, in accounting, kids of color aren't hearing about accounting and finance as an option. So, you know, our firm has decided, and you know, I'm 110% around just informing and educating and talking about opportunities to kids that didn't even know this is an option. But our strategic plan is broken into 3 areas: internal education, communication and accountability, early ID programs, outreach and external events, marketing, branding. And each of those, as you can see, are big, meaty areas. But when I think about early ID programs and outreach, we've developed 3 programs that really start at the freshman level of college. And by the way, we are also involved with some high school programs, but we do a webinar, we do an operational internship, and we do scholarships. And we link all 3 of those all the way into our traditional internship and full-time offer. And we start with freshmen in college, and we provide each of these kind of as stepping stones into a traditional internship and full-time role. But a lot of the outreach really begins with, you know, good faith efforts into diverse organizations on university campuses or in your community. If you're not doing campus recruiting or university recruiting, I encourage you to plug into whatever organization, again, but going back to your starting off point, if you're low in African Americans or Hispanic Americans or whatever it might be, maybe it's women, you know, understand your data and then go plug into those organizations. In the accounting space, we plug into a couple of organizations called National Association of Black Accountants, a Latino accounting organization called Alpha, an Asian accounting organization called Ascend. We also sponsor an organization called Accounting Career Awareness Program, which is talking about accounting options to underrepresented kids in middle school and high school. So there's a lot. I mean, you could go out, and I could even share a list of organizations. There's a lot of tremendous organizations that you can build relationships with, that you can conduct outreach with, and that you can link those individuals up to your early ID efforts and programs. So I think with that, I'll pause because there's a lot packed into there. And I know that it's an undertaking to get those programs off and started, and even an undertaking to do outreach to all of the great organizations that are out there.
Fantastic. Really quick, right before you, Daniel, just really quickly about the list of organizations that you have. Silke, if you don't mind sending those out so that people have actual steps and a first place to start, that would be fantastic. And for all of you that are on the call that are interested in learning more about university recruiting, maximizing the diverse groups within the schools that you're already recruiting at, and also how to create relationships and maximize HBCUs, we're going to have a whole session dedicated to that. So I saw a couple of things coming through in the chat, and we will dedicate an entire session to digging into how to do that. That being said, Daniel, hey, sorry.
I had a question, actually. Silke, what were your kind of 3 strategic buckets or priorities? Because they were really good, and I didn't write them down in time, because I'm going to steal that 100%.
Yeah, the first bucket is internal education, communication, and accountability. And that's everything from aligning your recruiting strategy to your organization's I&D strategy, equipping your recruiting teams with metrics, training, and tools, leveraging, different groups throughout your organization for funding, and then, of course, engaging your business resource groups to the extent your organization has them. The second bucket is early ID programs, outreach, and external events. And that's everything from outreach to diverse professional organizations, implementation of early ID programs, ensuring your campus roster, if you have university recruiting, includes diverse universities, whether it's Hispanic universities, Native universities, HBCUs, leveraging sourcing tools that identify and attract diverse candidates, and engaging your diverse alumni. And then the third bucket is marketing and branding. And that's really about collateral and ensuring kind of your website, your career site, talks about what you're doing for all things I&D, and also just evaluating your job boards and making sure that they're attracting diverse candidates, and working with vendors, that's an important and essential element to what they're doing.
Did you get it all that time, Daniel?
Thank you, Silke. Silke, can you?
I got the headline. Yeah.
Yeah.
Could you send that out to the group to make it available to everyone?
Will do.
And I was going to say, under the job posting, like sort of mention, obviously she had the third one, which is basically employer brand, right? The idea of like, ensuring that you guys have like a really strong employer brand, and you know what you're looking for, and you know how to get what you're looking for. Throw all of your job descriptions before you put them up through a gender sort of decoder. There are a lot of free ones out there. There's one that comes up at the top of the Google search, and you'll get a really interesting sense of whether they're sort of feminine coded or whether they're male coded, and that's super helpful in neutralizing some of that bias at the very beginning stages. A lot of people don't realize how easy it is. You literally copy and paste the job ad into this tool, and it spits out, exactly the words that are essentially, what is it that you call? It's called a gender decoder. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Okay, so Silke, we have a roadmap, right? We have the data, we have the beginning steps, we have the data, we have the roadmap. We know a little bit about recruiting strategies and how to leverage universities and funding. And then we get to the point where even whether they're intern candidates or sort of candidates that come through more traditional roles, we have to send them through the interview process. And sometimes the interview process, when you have multiple people on sort of your interview panel, it gets a little willy-nilly, right? And so, Simone, can you talk to us a little bit about how to mitigate some of the issues that might come through with the interview process?
Totally. And I think, we all have to think holistically, right? This is a very long, like, it's so interesting because when people from a sales org talk through like the sales funnel and how, like, if you're working in an enterprise company that sells to other businesses, these sales thing, like the timelines are so long. It's the same here, right? You have to really be prescriptive at every point. So I want to start off with a fun little quote, right? This quote's actually from a professor over at Harvard. It was an article 2016, and I think it really sort of sums up the importance of structured and evidence-based hiring techniques. So it's smarter design of our hiring practices and procedures may not free our minds from our shortcomings, but it can make our biases powerless, breaking the link between biased beliefs and discriminatory and often simply just stupid actions, right? And so that, I think, really sums it up. Like, the less room for error, the less error, right? And that's basically how structured interviewing works. I think in order to build an effective diversity program for your organization, you have to understand the goals and objectives as we've already sort of laid out, right? What are we striving for? Let's look at the numbers. Let's figure out a plan. But in order to actually get there, you have to roll out a lot of stuff through this interview process, namely structured interviewing, is a great way to affect change kind of in the moment. And it's a really like low lift, low cost kind of thing, right? Like, people have been mentioning data and all this stuff, and you have to, spend a lot of time. Like, with this stuff, you can throw in a couple of easy aspects to the process, and you'll get like much better experience from everyone. Namely because, the more structured something is, the higher the expectations, right? Candidates kind of know what they're going into. They have a much more consistent experience. So, NPS scores will increase, your satisfaction will increase from this whole process. And then on top of it, it just cuts down the time. People, don't have to prep as much because they're asking the same questions. Like, there's a whole bunch of stuff that kind of flows through, and, there's so many upsides. There's no real reason not to do this, right? So study after study exposes the fact that, and this is a big one, right? People generally like themselves, right? If left to their own devices, many of us would want to hire ourselves. So when hiring managers sit down for an interview, the biggest risk that we have as recruiters in successfully promoting the notion of diversity and equality through our hiring process is a manager who basically wants to hire a carbon copy of him or herself, right? And so we've probably all heard this. Like, you guys are probably nodding at home. You're like, oh wow, like, yeah, I was in a kickoff conversation with my hiring manager, and my hiring manager was like, I need a carbon copy of this person. That is exactly not what you want to hear, right? Like, you want to kind of pull that away. You want to move away from something, and this is legit called similarity bias. Like, it's a real thing. We want to like pull that process out, and we want to control it, and we want to create almost like a scientific experiment, because that's what essentially this is. It's a scientific process. We want to be evidence-based in the way that we decide this stuff. So I think like the key thing is, there's the similarity bias, which I just mentioned. There's confirmation bias, the idea of, spending the entire interview process looking for data that we sort of want to confirm our preconceived notion. Like, there's all this stuff, right? And so I think the idea is that, as I mentioned in the quote at the top of this little, sort of session, we got to know our biases, right? We got to know what we are thinking. We have to not be afraid of bias because it's a real thing. You can't eliminate it entirely. We have to own it to the point where the more structure we build, the better, end result we'll have. And I think, there's a great tool. You can Google it. Harvard University actually has a tool that can test your own biases. So it's an affinity tool. It's a whole thing. It's like 30 minutes. You click a bunch of stuff, and you realize that, like, this is a thing that everyone experiences. So I think the other thing to just bring up is, you guys probably all know Brené Brown, right? She had the Netflix special. She's written a number of different books in this space. She always mentions, like, through some of her, thought pieces, that people really create their own narrative, right? And if they, for example, don't have a piece of information, they're going to use that blank slate to kind of fill in the blanks, right? And as recruiters and hiring managers, and hiring teams, we need to transparently sort of build the narratives or at least performance cues, so that when we do begin to see, information from candidates come through and before the interview starts, we essentially can kind of find the information that we're looking for and not fill in too much. You don't want to fill in the blanks. You want to have as much evidence-based stuff there. The other thing I'd point to is the fact that you don't really need a fancy ATS. So if you guys are, at home or are working through a situation, where you have, Excel spreadsheets to do tracking, like it's not all that difficult to do this. The key thing to remember through this process is the less structure, the less creative freedom that people have. And that's what we need to remember. So I think, the tips that I was going to run through, the ideal candidate is defined by the business objectives of the job, right? So you have to be really, like, during that kickoff meeting, when you're sitting down with a hiring manager, you really need to drill down in that meeting on the objectives and tasks of the role. I think someone just mentioned in the comments that, it's really difficult. It might not necessarily be low cost to do structured interviewing, but it is, it's not necessarily low lift. The reality is, like, any change management that you go through as an organization is always going to involve, a lot of work and obviously effort to put into it. But I think, like, generally speaking, you don't need to be 100%, right? You can kind of do things slowly. You can start with 20 to 30% of this. The idea of, like, changing the way people think, the idea of really, and simplest thing ever, right? Asking questions about the long term of the role when you have a kickoff meeting, thinking 30, 69 days, 90 days down the pipe, being really focused in on what does this candidate need to have in order for us to make a hire, right? And I think, the other thing that, like, a ton of other things you can do, you can, be really assessment focused. That's something that we've done at the organization that I've worked at, most recently, and also, like, just throughout my career. Assessments are so amazing. If a candidate, for example, is interviewing for a PR or technical writer role, you essentially work closely with your hiring manager to figure out, like, what are we looking to measure here? What does this person need in that job in order to do that job, right? And you can ask for them to write up a PR pitch. You can ask them to put together, sort of some sort of exercise that will be able to, predict performance, because that's the real key thing. Like, this is an incredibly, effective tool. I mean, I think Google's been using this for years. Predicting performance is like such a key thing. And it's so evidence-based. I think the other thing to kind of think through is the timing. And again, this is super low lift. Ensuring that hiring managers and interview teams complete their feedback as soon as the interview ends, and then having a really specific rubric or kind of voting system. That could be a numbers-based score. That can be what's already in your ATS, which is, like, usually a yes, no, strong, no, then there's a strong yes. Or it can be a numbers-based score. And then really kind of thinking through, in terms of conformity, right? Like, that's another thing that we have to be wary of as recruiters. Don't discuss anything that you're talking about, through the interview process. Don't discuss it until the debrief where you all sit down together. You don't want people to say, oh, well, Sally liked Joe more than I like Joe, so now I like Joe more, right? You want it to stay sort of neutral. The other thing is, things that are qualitative, right? Like, this is such a human process, like choosing people to be on your team, which essentially it is. This is like the dodgeball of life, right? Like, the key thing to consider here is, like, likability. It's a real thing. If you find that people are like, oh, you know what, this person, I could really see a great addition on the team. Like, let's own it. Let's not let it cloud people's judgment. Let's put a score on it, right? And this is what I talk to my hiring managers about all the time. If you like someone more than you like someone else, if you think that they're more communicative, if you think they'll be a better fit, let's discuss that. Let's, like, use a number to kind of measure that, and let's add that to the rubric, right? And I think that the key thing is also, and again, like, I can go on for hours about this because there's so many different things that you can do. And again, like, yeah, if you want to do this at the 100% level, it's going to be super intense lift. But if you want to start out slowly and scale as you grow and, really kind of add in these little things here and there to the process to make it more structured, that's a great way to kick it off. You don't need to be at 100% on day 2. You can do this over time in a slow, methodological kind of way. The other thing that I would say, though, is like, and this is probably the most important thing, because, as we've already talked about, right, you have data from your employee population, you have data from the applications, then you go through this whole process of employer branding to try and get the right people. Then you're posting jobs on diverse job boards. At the end of the day, you need your hiring managers to be open, right? And like, this isn't necessarily, again, like, diversity is such a wide scope of things. We're very afraid to kind of think about what diversity truly is to an organization. A lot of people don't really know what that is. You know, it's a weird topic. It's hard to put a number on it. Like, what is it? Is it racial? Is it ethnic? Is it socioeconomic? Ultimately, hiring managers need to be open because, as it goes back to the point one, you don't want to hire yourself, right? So if you're not hiring yourself, what are you hiring? And I think that that's the difficulty for a lot of hiring managers. And I think the more open they are and the more structured a process it is and the more evidence-based a process it is, and the more, you know, we have like the process flanked, you know, with things like assessment, you're going to have a truly successful hiring experience and ultimately a successful hire if those hiring managers are open. And if, you know, maybe they don't have 100% of what you want in a candidate. Maybe they did a really great assessment, but ultimately it's going to take them 7 to 8 months longer to ramp than someone else. You have to kind of understand each of these things and ultimately decide what's the opportunity cost. Is that opportunity cost worth it? And can we like have someone on the team? Can someone else pick up the work for the first 3 months? Like if we do envision a longer ramp, really keeping, you know, that kind of stuff in key. I think that there's also been a lot of, and I'm curious to hear from the panel a little bit on the unconscious bias training. That's something that I've always like struggled with, right? Like, cause these training sessions are real expensive, guys. Like they eat up your budget real fast, right? They're like 10 to 15 grand for the most part. You know, there's a lot of stuff where people will click through, they'll do their own kind of bias training. What has everyone in our panel kind of, you know, sort of historically done? I mean, I've done some here and there. I mean, Amazon had a really incredible how to hire process. So they would essentially train internal employees who were at the company a number of years to teach people how to do structured interviewing. And of course, bias falls into that, right? Because we're trying to train people against these aspects. But what is that? How does everyone feel about unconscious bias training?
Just really quickly before we jump into that, because we're running a little bit short on time, so I also just want to be mindful. Just really quickly, the affinity tool that Simone mentioned through Harvard to sort of test your own unconscious bias. The link is in the chat for anyone who would take advantage of that.
For adding it, person.
Thank you to Kylo Donahue for that. We do have about 3 minutes or so if we want to just sort of round robin or around the table and talk a little bit about unconscious bias. And if this is something that everyone would like to hear from during a future session as well, we could probably do an entire session on the effectivity of unconscious bias training, and then even do a little bit in room, like what are the things that we're looking for and what are some low-hanging fruit that we can educate other folks about. But Silke, Daniel, Sean, any thoughts quickly about unconscious bias training and if it's a yes or a no for you?
I would say absolutely. And if you can get your entire organization trained up, I would. And the other thing is, I would encourage you to do extra training for your recruiting team. And what I mean by that is not just unconscious bias, recognizing it, but also how to address it, because it's really our obligation in the recruiting and HR space to address it and recognize it. But also the other thing is this idea of cultural fit. We've all heard in the interview process, oh, this person's just not the quite fit or not the quite cultural fit. So a lot of trainings address that too. And it's such an important thing. So I agree. We could probably do a whole session on this and really talk about, equipping everybody in this space.
Yeah, the organization that I worked with, actually, I just worked through it with all the C-suite leaders, and I was like, we need to ban cultural fit. That whole term, like, this isn't a situation where you want to hire someone so you can grab a beer with them after work. This is a situation where they have to have like evidence, like we have to have evidence as to why they're good in the job. And culture fit is such an easy catch-all for like all the reasons why we don't think someone's, good for the role and not actually evidence-based. So I totally agree.
Yeah, you nailed that. It's ad. It's culture ad. They're going to contribute something different than what everybody else already has. With unconscious bias, I know LinkedIn Learning has a couple. So if any of your organizations have the enterprise learning subscription, there are a few there. Another thing that I'm toying with the idea, and I'm kind of curious to get people's perspective on this. So kind of ties in, so structured interviewing and unconscious bias. So with structured interviewing, I think, Simone, you were right on. Don't aim for 100% right away. Start with maybe your most frequent customer group, right? Who do you hire for the most? Because it's going to be the same job over and over again. So that just lends itself to having a standardized process where you're going to have these same 3 people, whether it's role or specific actual people. Here's your role in the interview. Here's what you're going to ask, and then we're going to debrief, right? So you start with them. If you hire 20 inside sales reps a year, boom, that's where you start. And just work with that group and involve them in the process of creating your new structured interview. And then you can lend your expertise where needed, but they feel like they're owning it and they're driving it. So I think that's a really easy way to start structured interview process. The thing I'm toying with, because I'm going through this right now as well with one of my teams. So we hire a lot for like first level IT technicians, whether it's a service desk or it's actually somebody who comes out to your office and fixes your thing that you broke. So I'm thinking about putting at the end of the interview evaluation a simple checklist. So you've kind of gone through all your interviews or your interview with this candidate, and now you're kind of summarizing your thoughts and maybe your rating. And then what if you just have a little reminder at the bottom, like, have you checked yourself as the interviewer for the affinity bias, like that similar to me bias? Have you stereotyped this person unnecessarily, or have you put any like halo or horn effect, right? Either the first thing they said immediately you're like, yeah, they're the greatest, or like they said one thing and now you're demonizing their entire interview performance because of one thing you said. And just putting those kind of 3 simple questions at the end of your interview evaluation sheet, because it's there. And then like you're always going to see it and you can review it, or a manager can say, oh, as I'm filling this out, oh crap, maybe I did do that and I should rethink this interview. So I'm toying with that idea. I haven't done it yet.
Yeah, I think all really great points. And look, we'll dedicate an entire session to unconscious bias, as I mentioned, and we'll even delve into some of the studies that some people feel that unconscious bias is not affecting performance in organizations. My personal feeling is that it's like doing spot training, right? You could do a whole bunch of crunches. It's not going to do anything if you're grossly overweight. However, crunches are a great thing. Part of an overall exercise and diet plan, right? So it can either really enhance and serve as a foundation, or if you just do it by itself, sometimes it sort of falls by the wayside. But we'll have an entire conversation sort of dedicated to that, and we'll delve a little bit deeper. Sean, any last thoughts?
Yeah, one last thought I would add quickly was Simone's comment about the budgetary constraints. If budgetary is a constraint to you, what I'd recommend is skilling up somebody to become a black belt on your team, and then they're kind of that go-to person, so they're ongoing. I don't think change occurs in a one-time training session. It's about that long-term play. So have somebody at that skill level to support the team and kind of take some ownership around it. So that's where if I had this amount of budget, I'm going to get as much as I can out of this person, and they better not leave once they get there. There's that, right? All kinds of issues. But to develop that so you can go long-term versus a one-time short-term is how I would spend my money.
Totally. And make it conversational. Remember, people don't do well in situations where they're spoken to for an hour. Like really like push the boundaries, like get people really emotional, get people really supercharged, involved, like have them, really think about what's going on in this conversation, because it's important. And ultimately, if they aren't knowing their own biases, then this whole process, as you pointed out, Christina, you need a holistic view on this. This isn't just a one-stop shop solution.
Yeah. Thank you so much for all of your time and expertise. And for everyone on the call, we just want to remind you that we will be here the first Wednesday of every month talking about everything diversity, equity, and belonging. Hopefully you've walked away today with some actionable steps that you can start to use right away. Hopefully you've saved the links in the chat for some tools and resources. And we will see you next month.
Real quick on that, Christina. So the notes, I'll start getting notes and make them available, like the chat stuff, getting those available for follow-up by posting them online.
Great.
I'm also working on a transcribing service for these conversations in case somebody wants to look up verbatim words or what have you. So I got things to do on my list about continuing this beyond just the videos and stuff like that. So it's all in the works. I'm getting to it sooner or later.
That's good. I'm excited. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you so much,
Thank
guys.
you so
So
much.
nice
This
meeting
was
you
great.
all.
Bye, everyone. Good luck.
Bye.